Spire, The City Must Fall is a tabletop RPG written by Grant Howitt and Christopher Taylor and illustrated by Adrian Stone. It was published in 2018 after a Kickstarter. The game takes place on a dark fantasy arcology, or singular structure that is so large that it contains an entire society. This structure is called Spire, and it is populated by hundreds of thousands, maybe even a couple of million, elves. Some of these are high elves, or elfir, and they rule over Spire with a cold, brutal hand. The rest are dark-skinned elves, or drow, who work and toil in the middle and lower sections of the structure. You play as a drow, who has become enlisted in a resistance movement against the elfir, and you use all manner of magic, violence, brute force, and stealth to see your mission carried out. There is no truly definitive illustration of Spire in the book, so you have to imagine what a mile-high dark fantasy super tower would even look like. And the origin of the tower is also left a mystery, but as the story goes, first there was the Tower of Spire, and no one knows where it came from. Then, long ago, the drow moved in, and presumably lived in peace. Then, a few hundred years ago, the pale-skinned elfir from the freezing cold north invaded and took over. Now they occupy the upper sections of the structure, and everyone else toils below. The book describes other locations outside of Spire, as well as a war with jackal-faced gnolls happening elsewhere, but the game is supposed to take place in Spire itself. There is exactly one playable race in Spire, and that is the drow. They are classically portrayed with black, gray, or occasionally white skin, and with a hereditary connection to spiders. Instead of carrying their unborn, the drow of Spire lay eggs from which drow babies hatch. Sometimes those babies have spider-like features, but the book only mentions that in passing, and all drow are harmed by sunlight. The chief enemy race in Spire are the High Elves, or Elfir. They float about just above the ground due to the amount of magic coursing in their blood and wear masks almost fanatically. They titrate the power of the sun and use it to magically cool their environments at the top of Spire, and take ice baths in order to stay sane and happy. Most importantly of all, the Elfir are cruel masters. The book claims to wash its hands on the topic of slavery, but in fact the drow are casually bought and sold between the ages of 13 and 16 and forced to serve the Elfir at various times in their lives without pay. So there are many flavors of slavery in this game. Then the book includes humans. Almost all of the technology and invention in Spire is made by human hands, and they exist as outsiders, few and far between. There is some mention of them having their own territory on Spire, but they don't constitute a very noticeable presence. Oh, and there are also gnolls, who are either lowly servants or cutthroat criminals hiding in the shadows, or gardeners. The idea behind the game is that your drow character gets brought into the Ministry of our Hidden Mistress, a secretive organization hell-bent on degrading and destroying Elfir power and influence in Spire. The book lists some principles to go by. You can see from this list that the game experience is intended to be pretty harsh and humorless by and large. You're not only pretty much bound to get hurt and die in a labyrinthine plot, but you might even get sold out by the Ministry itself. Spire uses a bunch of different dice, but at the core you're throwing a lot of d10s for action. If you're making a check, you will throw at a minimum one d10 to see where you land on a hard schedule of outcomes. If you have more than one d10 on a throw, you take the highest of the rolled results and then consult the schedule. You can get more d10s for a check by having the relevant skill, having the relevant domain, or having mastery in the relevant action, skill, or domain. The GM can remove up to 2 d10s from your pool to account for difficult situations or other factors, but you'll always be rolling at least one d10 for a check. If you noticed, the game deals out a lot of stress. You can take stress to one of 5 core stats, or resistances. The GM determines the amount of possible stress to take by choosing a die to roll for the amount. For example, beating up a sick and broken Elfir that you've cornered in a bathhouse will only cause D3 stress on a failure. Breaking into the back of a busy alehouse might incur D6 stress on a failure, while tricking an elite guard into unlocking a secure gate would be D8 stress on a failure. You can reduce stress in several ways as well. The thing is, every time your character takes stress to a stat, the GM rolls a d10, and if their result is lower than the stat taking the stress, then the character suffers either a minor, moderate, or severe fallout. The fallout itself removes some stress, but heaps on all kinds of narrative setbacks depending on the resistance that failed the fallout check. So, with just a few bad rolls, your character could be facing some pretty dire setbacks almost right out of the gate, and as you accumulate stress, there is a higher chance of even worse fallout, which is to say, the game does not encourage brash, reckless actions that require lots of rolls. When you start off, your character gets 2 out of 9 skills and 2 out of 9 domains. These don't level up or anything, they're just on or off checkboxes that afford an extra d10 on an action check. Actually, you can double up on a skill or domain once more and have what's called mastery, and that can afford 1 extra d10 to heap onto a check, but that's pretty much it. Also, the GM never rolls checks for an NPC. Instead, a player's roll, whether it be success, failure, or somewhere in between, determines what or how an NPC acts or reacts. I think skills and domains are where the game could have become a lot crunchier, but they kept it very straightforward here. That being said, a character can have some pretty varied mechanics in the form of their abilities. The book describes 10 drow archetypes to choose from, each with their own starting stats as well as bonds and equipment. Many of these types are described in unique terms that can only fit in the setting of Spire, but where they really differ from each other are through their abilities. Each type has 2 unique starting abilities that bring one kind of distinct game mechanic or another, but then by leveling up, they gain access to their own menu of low, medium, and high abilities. Interestingly, the book only describes character advancement as having made a small, medium, or large difference in Spire. No experience points and no milestones really. Just stir things up and then get a new ability. There is a whole other set of low, medium, and high abilities that are tied to factions as well, each of which have specific requirements before you can unlock them. I appreciated this quite a bit since it breathed a lot of life into some of the organizations of Spire, well beyond just creatively naming and describing them. By joining one of these groups and serving them, your character can actually pick up actionable powers and abilities. I have to say, the sheer breadth of different abilities across the 10 archetypes and all of these factions is huge, and really could provide a lot of varied gameplay experiences over time. About half of the 226-page book is dedicated to describing districts, factions, and some of the NPCs who belong to them. It's really where the authors prove that they have thought a tremendous amount about the Tower of Spire and all that it contains. I can't go through each of them here, but I will say that I read every last one of them with great interest and a lot of highlighting. The setting has been compared to the worlds of writer China Mieville, author of Perdido Street Station and The Scar, and I think it's a fair comparison. The fantasy here is full of grungy, dangerous magic, and creepy creatures like giant corvids and massive bug zeppelins. There's so many cults and religions described in this section that there's probably no way for you to avoid some kind of religious fanaticism in your game. Notably, there are a lot of strange and creative ways that Spire's society disposes of dead bodies. Bodies can be sold to fungus farms, fed to sacred hyenas, given to giant ravens, tossed into an unfathomably deep pit where at the bottom long white worms eat some of your brain and steal your memories, or, if you're lucky, buried in a rare patch of dirt somewhere. The novel weirdness goes on and on actually. There's a crystal shard which telepathically links the minds of those who insert smaller bits of the shard into their brains. There's a paradimensional being that is trying to infect everyone in Spire through charity bread. And deep in the bowels of the tower, there is a completely twisted Lovecraftian realm called Heart that drives people mad but contains a gateway to drow heaven, among other things. This realm has spawned its own expansion book. Despite the overwhelming amount of detail in the setting, the GM advice does boil everything down to a few understandable touchstones, and suggests that the GM present a session in 3 defined acts. There's also a decent number of additional gods thrown in at the end, and some random tables for more on-the-fly details. Alright, so here are my thoughts on Spire, The City Must Fall. Cons. Organization. I found the descriptions of each of the districts to be great, but they are each only loosely organized. When reading through any particular district, areas, factions, and NPCs are all treated the same typographically. It's fine on a first read through, but if as a GM you're going back through the book looking for a particular area, faction, or NPC, there is no visual cue as to what paragraph describes what kind of information at a glance. I guess in the end, each of these info blocks also means to serve as a standalone plot hook, so in that sense, they don't all need to be meticulously categorized. GM bookkeeping. By the default rules, it's the GM who tracks all of the players' stress levels. The problem with gatekeeping this information is that players can also ask at any time how their character is looking, in which case the GM is expected to summarize their stress number array in a narrative descriptive way. That could end up being a lot of creative summarizing for one person to do. The alternative, of course, is just to allow the players to keep track of their own stress levels and have them do the describing of their characters. This could relieve the GM of a pretty heavy responsibility when running a session. Pros: true novelty. The concept of people on an arcology living below and fighting their oppressors above is actually a pretty old one in science fiction. Spire does mix it up by replacing the people with elves, but where it really shines is in the number of cultures, cults, and other oddities woven into the setting. It's described in such detail as to feel like a living, breathing civilization, but there's still enough mystery to make it fun for more inventive GMs. Ancient catacomb technology, interdimensional and dark magic, and the very origin of the tower are three huge sources of such mystery. Mechanics match the setting. It's not just that every player's stats are called resistances or that they take on stress, because those are great word choices for what your PC is working with. It's really that the mechanics are fairly harsh, with a constant mounting thread of fallouts with every roll. This matches the setting, which is a backdrop of brutal oppression and desperate, equally brutal resistance. Writing. The authors, I think, are only able to achieve this very unique and realized setting with great and sometimes incredible writing. Page after page, there are descriptions of people and places that seem truly new and fascinating. These days I'm often wondering about the durability of RPGs, as in how much replayability do they have? Often it comes down to depth, both in a proposed setting as well as its mechanical flexibility and approach. I can't speak to Spire's mechanics in the long term, but I think that its setting is very durable. Spire is a dark and scary place to go, but if you go there, you might end up staying a while. Thanks as always for watching. This is Dave signing off. See ya.